QALYfied, Episode 3 Regulatory Pathways for Fun and Profit.
Hello, healthcare nerds. Welcome to QALYfied, the podcast where we talk about the business and science of medical technology in a fun, sassy, and analytical way. I'm your host, Augustus, the overnight VC, and I started the healthcare practice at one of the most active health tech VCs in Singapore and Southeast Asia.
And hi, my name is Yan Lin, a medtech industry insider and your awkward friend who talks about industry so you don't have to.
This is where population health and market economics comes in, right? Because ideally, you want a population, maybe not a population of one, but a population of whatever the localized, wherever, however you define that local segment, you want it to be as specific to that and responsive to that particular population. But the challenge is some populations are small to the extent that, or maybe it's not economically attractive to localize to that extent. And that's where I think we have the situation in which the richest populations, the largest populations, those are what devices, therapeutics are always developed and catered to.
So I would say there's a difference between market value and market size, right? The US is still about 50% of the global healthcare market just by itself, and they're only about 330 million people.
Right.
So they're not the biggest market, but they're the biggest market value. So historically, most medical devices are developed for Americans. So they are basically their population demographics of what diseases most affect them.
For sure.
Will get more funding.
Of course.
And those devices will get,
of course,
right?
And at the same time, they are the most expensive per capita. So that's something that everyone's like, oh no, that's terrible. It's so expensive. It's terrible. But the upside is that they get all the good stuff.
Well, they get not necessarily good stuff, but they get stuff made for them.
Yeah, they get more things specifically to them because they're paying more.
Yes, but the paying more is a complex issue. We probably had to break through that at a different time. But it's estimated that about 50% of healthcare costs in the United States is administrative cost. Not actually healthcare costs.
Interesting. Okay.
And in the world of diagnostics, the common, I don't want to call it a joke, but irony, I suppose, is 5% of healthcare costs, 95% of decision making. So it's very disproportionate. You spend 5% of your budget, but this is where you decide what to happen next. And it triggers everything else downstream of that. So it's almost the what is called the gateway, right, to the rest of the healthcare system. And that's why diagnostics is important, but very underestimated most of the time. For
a variety of reasons.
For a large variety.
A lot of it economic.
It's very this whole thing about which population you design for is huge. In some ways, there have been drugs and panels out there that, let's say, are gold standard, or not even gold standard, but standard stuff for various populations, and they just don't work for people like you and me.
Right.
Okay. So carbamazepine is one of those drugs very commonly used in the Western world. But Han Chinese, we have a genetic difference that makes us potentially have a very bad side effect.
Sure.
Okay, so guess what? In Taiwan, before they prescribe this drug, it's gold standard to test you, basically do a pharmacogenetic panel to see whether you have this weird gene or not, and therefore if you're likely to have this side effect.
And what is this drug targeted towards?
Transplants, I think.
Transplants, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think it's used for some other things, but I'm not a pharmacologist, so I can't remember the whole list. But I know it's a commonly used drug.
Okay, just basically, if you hear something like this in your hand, probably avoid unless you're tested.
Well, just test first, right?
It's always good to test first.
Yeah, because it's a CYP450. Okay. So there's that's the weird thing with a lot of these drugs. A lot of it has been developed on Western populations, especially the older drugs, right? Now there's, lots of drug outfits all around the world who are developing things.
Yeah.
But in the early days, it was mostly Westerners. And genetically, we are different enough that basically a lot of times the drugs are not as effective on us or too effective on us, and then we get a lot of side effects. So in some ways, now that sort of the biopharma industry is more global, we're going to have a bigger set of stuff that is developed for, our population.
Yeah.
But the other thing that has changed as well over the years is the requirements by regulators all around the world. So you've got regulators in Japan, Korea, and China, all saying you have to do local population trials. Right. So even if it's approved by the FDA, when you try to come into China, the CFDA says you must do a local trial.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So that adds to the lag, though, because usually if it's a Western company, they launch in the US first, they start making sales, and then they say, okay, maybe I should go to Asia.
Yeah.
And then they'll put a submission to the CFDA and say, hey, I would like to do a trial because that's what you require. It's going to take another 2 years for that at least, and then you do another, registration. So there's a time lag.
There's not just a time lag, there's also a perverse selection, right? In which and this is where we always think, like, I guess from the business side, we always think, oh, regulatory is such a pain. You have to do the local, why don't we just not do the local test, and try to figure out a way to get through it. And I guess the other side of it is then people just make the decision that whether this market is valuable enough that I even bother to register. Like, if it's not valuable enough, why would I? And obviously China can do it because they're large market at least.
Yeah.
And some markets don't have that kind of incentive for someone to go through. We have even that in Singapore, because in Singapore, why would I even register? Like, it's really troublesome. And then we have some other countries where they've decided that maybe it makes sense to just accept registrations in other markets, like Hong Kong, for example.
Yeah.
So there's still kind of a perverse disincentive in a way, even though it's meant to be for safety.
Yeah. So this is the thing where, it's not even just the clinical trials. A lot of countries, they have different registration pathways.
Right.
So it can't even be the same application. You have to change the format, whatever.
Hopefully harmonization.
So, I used to attend the ASEAN harmonization workforce.
It's still going on.
It's been long time, at least a decade.
At least a decade. I remember.
So, and I'm not sure how close they are to harmonizing.
We know that some places have harmonized. We know that Singapore is pretty much the same dossier as Malaysia, except with maybe slight variation in terms of what's a class A, class B, that kind of a thing.
Yeah,
but it's essentially the same.
But imagine that it's like essentially the same except for. But then you have 23 countries that all have the except for.
But it's good that it's 80%, right? Like 80%.
Obviously, I mean it's better than nothing. But that's just even the starting point. Right. That's not even talking about the content of your submission. Right. It's just like format and potentially a slightly different standard that you're using that you have to look out for, and so that's the reason why most countries other than United States have time lag between when it was in the world and if you say to a layperson it's 5 years, it sounds like, wow, oh my gosh, we're so backward. Right. Probably pretty standard. I think Japan, which is the second probably largest economy for medical, because we are not counting Europe as one entire market. It's too complicated for that. So we'll say Japan. They have their own local ecosystem of
providers.
they're still about 5 years behind.
Yeah.
So what's the hope for the rest of us? What's the chance that we get the newest stuff when it comes out?
But this is where I guess countries are increasingly incentivized to harmonize, right? Even though there is still a little bit of a lag in harmonization. And this, I think, is a very Singapore approach whereby we're going to be the driver, right? Because, I mean, you think about it like from a pragmatic perspective, if you're US or CE or CFDA China, I think they've renamed it as something else. But if you're the reference for everyone else, generally you get the first registration, and Singapore wants to be the reference for Southeast Asia.
Yeah, it's very political.
It's very political.
So if the wind blows one direction, we're all friends. The wind blows a different direction, we're not going to be friends, right? This is one of the troubles. And also, just in Singapore context, you didn't have a huge regulatory science body until 10 years ago. And even then, 10 years ago, you only started training people in regulatory science. So the depth of knowledge is not more than 10 years old for the most part. No. There's a few individuals, obviously, that have global experience and all that kind of stuff. But how are you going to run an agency, basically, that is the size, potentially, of the FDA or the EMEA or the CFDA to regulate for all the stuff that is coming through for Southeast Asia? You need a lot of talent to do that.
Let me tell you something crazy, which I just found out about recently, which is that in New Zealand, you don't require pre-market approval for devices.
Because it has registration elsewhere, or what?
No, you can register. You can self-register, but you don't require pre-approval. It's not related to whether you have approvals elsewhere. So pretty much, so that's the interesting thing, which I was like, oh wow, New Zealand is like, we think of it as like, well, at least now it's a very kind of like health-centric, given the response to COVID-19 and all of that. So apparently, before the harmonization effort, Australia and New Zealand wanted to set up a common regulatory body, which makes sense because they're so close. But when they started to, when Australia joined as, I think, one of the founding members for the harmonization effort, they put this on hold, and Australia has been obviously part of the harmonization effort, using CE as kind of a standard, but also it's a bit of a blend of CE and FDA. But they're doing that, and New Zealand has pretty much stopped, and they're only looking, I think, at at making efforts towards harmonization in 2022. So it's just interesting that some countries are still at that stage.
No, there are many countries.
Okay, there are many countries. There are many countries.
So there are many countries that just don't have the talent, the regulatory science talent to actually register all these devices. Even Malaysia, I remember attending one of the AHWP. So that's the ASEAN harmonization.
Should we bleep out all these country names?
Maybe. I just remember attending that, and literally, and this was probably 5 years ago, so hopefully it's improved since then. But they literally were saying like, we don't have the bandwidth to look through all these dossiers. And some of these stuff is so complicated, we can't understand what's in it anyway, right? So then it becomes like they're going with a market registration process, which is just sign your name, tell me what you're selling.
Self-registration,
But I don't know necessarily why is that good or bad. And
we don't check it.
I'm not making an assessment whether this is safe or efficacious. I'm just letting you sign your name. So if there's a recall, I know who to go against.
That's right.
Right?
So buyer beware.
Yes, buyer beware.
Oh God.
So I mean, and it's the same. India as well. Also, they didn't have quite enough. And there's a lot of homegrown stuff. That already has been grandfathered in, so it's on the market. Then how do you back register all that stuff that's already in the market? It becomes logistically very complicated. And frankly, regulatory science is not the most well-funded of public bureaus usually. Right? So it becomes, just a massive manpower challenge of even before you even look at the science part of trying to qualify these things.
So this is the crazy question, because like healthcare, I mean, we think of healthcare as being around for a long time, at least relatively long from a technology standpoint. Because I always think of healthcare, like technology is, is part of it. It's a strong part of it. It's a technology industry, and technology, when we think about it now, is like, computers and AI and everything. But technology is kind of a moving target. Once it becomes standard, like I'm sure, like a plaster was technology at some point of
Yeah.
time, right? So in that way, you think of healthcare as being a very long technology play, but even now, people just don't have their shit together. No
Yeah.
one has their shit together.
Yeah, but I mean, if you look at it just in medical device, if you're interested and are bored, go to FDA website.
Yeah.
Okay, and there's a section on there that you can find that is just like medical device registrations.
Yeah.
And it's basically everything that's in the market.
Yeah, it's like
Alright?
every single category has a number and
Yeah.
subcategory.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've gone through
And
that. Yeah.
you'll see how just absolutely massive the
Di-
diversity
yeah.
of
Yeah.
stuff in the world
Yeah,
that is.
Of course.
Right?
Of course.
And you're just trying to keep track of all of that.
Yeah.
Even that is already a big
Yeah.
overhead,
Yeah.
to be honest. So when you say, medtech as a category, there's probably 5,000 different product types, product categories,
Yeah.
and then subcategories
Yeah.
under that. There's very few countries that have the willingness to spend the amount of money that it takes to be on top
Sure.
of all of it.
Sure.
Very few.
But there is a technology that we can use to resolve this. Blockchain. I'm just kidding.
Bullshit. Yeah. So I mean, in some ways, we obviously FDA historically has been the big bad wolf in the industry. Everybody's scared because if they get
the biggest stick.
Yeah, they have a very big stick. They have the biggest market. So if you can't get into that, then okay. So in some ways, the rest of us, the rest of the world, are free riders on the FDA system.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah.
They do the hard work, and the rest of us look at them and say, "Great, now
Let's
I'll use
do
it."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So historically Taiwan as well, even though they are very advanced medically, they just wait for the FDA to give approval before they approve locally.
Sure.
Right. And so many countries just use that as a standard. If it's CE mark or FDA, I'll just let it through.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm not gonna look at it.
So shouldn't the FDA just launch its online education platform to train everyone else?
I wish they could, but I think it's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
Because you can imagine just in every product category you need an expert who can even understand what these details mean.
Yeah.
Right?
How big do you think the FDA is?
Pretty large.
Tens of thousands.
I'm not sure about tens of thousands, but I know they're pretty large, and I also
the
know
largest.
that they have a network of consultants.
Oh, of course, a network
Right.
of external consultants.
Because when some random, I don't know what
of
disease
course.
profile
Of course.
thing comes in, they
That
go
makes
look for the
sense.
top 3 or 4 people who
that
knows
makes
about that to
sense.
help them make an assessment.
Yeah.
So, they have that kind of network, and which means they have the pull, so to speak, to bring these people to come and sit down with them and talk to them. If you are a small nation without much history, what's the chances that you can pull 3 or 4 top KOLs in the world to sit down and talk to you about this thing, right? And help make an assessment.
Yeah.
I think that's much harder.
Or you can also say it, and maybe this is also another thing which is maybe a little bit Singaporean, although we probably don't invest as much in that, is that you can think of the regulatory apparatus as a agenda setter and a market driver if you invest resources into it, because the FDA is such a big stick. It attracts first registrations, it attracts a whole industry around it, and then from a country standpoint, if you want to be like that, you have to invest in your own regulatory apparatus and the experts around it and the whole industry around it, rather than just like, oh, this is a cost center and we don't want to spend money on it. We just want to follow someone else. You'll always be the follower. You'll never be the agenda setter.
Yeah, and unfortunately, people don't think that far.
Yeah.
Because they just look at it and say like, you know what we need to invest in? More startups. Right? I'm going to set
We'll
up...
all go to the US.
Yes.
And that would be the answer.
Yes, because that's market access.
Yeah.
Right? And you see that, like, London used to be the center for a lot of the regulatory science for Europe. Right? That's where the bureau was set. Now the Brexit has happened, they have to move. And so they're moving, I think, something like that. I think the total staff was close to 10,000, but not everybody wanted to go. And so, they're trying to move into Amsterdam somewhere. they can't even find a facility large enough to house all the stuff that goes on in this bureau, right? And it's a big loss because the reason why so many medical technologies and pharma companies had some office in London was because that agency was there.
Right.
Because they have to work with them on a regular basis to get stuff done. And so it makes sense to have office.
Yeah.
Once the agency moves, all these companies will have to move as well. Right? That's a lot of high-end jobs that you're losing as a result.
Yeah.
The whole industry has to shuffle over to another place to make it work.
Right.
So yeah, there's not going to be a fix, but so often I see news blurbs or even like in the newspaper, it's like, oh, X and X country or X and X city wants to be the new bio innovation hub or the new whatever hub.
Right.
And they're like, oh, they're committing X amount of dollars to build buildings and labs, and then we're gonna bring in innovation. And it's like, fine, you know, that's a good start, obviously, to have somewhere to house people, but where's your talent coming from, right? And then what's your market? Because if you build it there and there's no VCs to fund it, there's no talent to help you grow the size of your company, headcount, and then there's no market for you to sell into, really, how much of it is a hub is it?
Yeah.
Right?
Also, this is that's a bigger question around innovation, which is...
So, but, you know, that's the thing about medical. If you don't understand regulatory science, you are actually not in the medical industry. Okay? Because you're never going to get a market, a product to market if you don't understand regulatory science.
Yeah.
So if we don't teach that as part of the
even from the product development standpoint,
you need to have it as a base level.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
That's so this is the crazy thing, right? People always think, oh, why are you involved in healthcare? You can do fintech, which is also very regulated, by the way. But you know, like, why would you do this? It's so difficult. You know, I'm sure there's lots of other things that are less regulated, that you can do more innovation, and the regulation is like the halt on innovation. But to be honest, I find that having that regulatory environment, the fact that the structures actually makes it a little bit more fun. I don't know, this sounds so weird, but for me, I find it's really fun because I can understand this is the universe of possibilities in which I'm playing, and any innovation has to sit within this universe, and then like you kind of like know, it's almost gamified, like you know, like these are the doors you unlock to get from one end to the other. And so I don't know why people don't like that, because I love that, and that's why like when I first started out, the first thing I did was look at, you know, the FDA, the CE, look at all the device classifications and try to understand like what's the regulatory environment looks like. That's the fun part about business because everything else is so straightforward. Come on, like profit.
I feel like your investors may be like, but Augustus doesn't like profit.
This is the gamified part. This is the part that if you can unlock the pathway, you are doing what no one else can do.
Yeah, but here's the thing: like we don't train our people to think that way.
Yeah.
Because you train a bunch of engineers, they're like, that's cool.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make that.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And so they build this thing, and great, it's a proof of concept. Yeah. But it's not thought through in terms of the context of where this has to go.
Yeah.
Right? And basically that's what regulatory science is about. Yeah. It's like it's forcing you to make sure you've got all your T's crossed and your I's dotted and you've thought about everything before you let it out in the world.
Yeah. But maybe their UI is just not very user friendly. Like it should be more gamified.
Yeah. I unfortunately I think most public bureaus don't have a huge budget to gamify things.
Yeah. I do like that in Singapore when you're trying to figure out what class device, you have this quiz where you kind of like tick and it goes through a little workflow. Like I thought that was really cool.
Yeah. So I think also the other thing is like more and more stuff happens where it just doesn't fit in a category.
Yeah.
It's like a completely new method of doing something.
Yeah, sure.
So actually, you know, a lot of the big regulatory agencies have basically what they call like informal meetings, or basically you can book an appointment. Where it's like non-binding, but like let me explain to you what weird thing I'm trying to do and how you would think about regulating it, right?
Yeah.
But that's
put on your game master hat.
Yeah, it's a guidance how to move forward, and that's how you do your weird stuff, right? If there's no predicate, if there's no predicate, there's nothing you can copy.
Yeah.
Like nobody has done it before. You have to go to the regulator as early as possible to figure out, does this make sense? Like if I choose these gold standard ways, or I choose this kind of test rig, is it demonstrative of what you're trying to look for in terms of safety and efficacy? So yeah, there's not, I think that's the problem. There's not one simple answer. And the people who do this and do this well, the reason why they do it well is because they have a lot of experience. They've seen lots of random things come through the door before, and they've thought over the years,
the principles,
right?
Principles,
how to apply. So, you know, again, if you have a market that has less than 10 years history in regulatory science, where are you going to get your talent from? Right? So it's very common in these kind of markets, you basically just do things that are predicates. Things that already exist in the market, you have something to compare to, you can benchmark, right? But it's just completely something new. I think most countries who have only a 10-year history would suffer in terms of having the right background to understand what's going on.
And in terms of the startup, I mean, in terms of the startup space, this is the thing that I find like it's very polar opposites how people think about regulatory risk, because like some people are just like, oh, if you think about it as an obstacle, just an obstacle to just jump through, then the immediately the first thing you want to do is you want to develop something that has very low regulatory risk, whereby there's lots of predicates and like I can just click and I get I get the 510K. Whereas like that automatically means that you're not innovative. And you're not doing something in a generative space. And so like I'm always confused, like why do you want to do that? You've already written yourself into a box. You should be doing the space where that gives, I mean, it still has to have like economic, like business value and value to populations, but you want to have that room that makes a regular person think like I'm puzzled. And that shows you that you are in an innovation space. So there are a couple of, generally, I agree. Generally, I agree, because the other thing that happens as well when you say I'm a 510K, or basically there's a predicate, you know, whatever. There's someone else,
it also means that your reimbursement pathway is going to be the same. Okay, so you're going to get the exact same dollar amount as your predicate. You know. So you're not being rewarded for innovation. So unless your innovation is just making your thing much, much cheaper, and therefore you get the nicer margin.
Is not really innovation.
Okay, but it is a thing. It's a way to make money. It's a way to make money. So yes, that's one way to go. The thing with the follow the leader kind of thing is there's some of these predicates that are, it's how far you can get away with it. Let's put it that way. Right? So for example, a lot of medical robotics actually fall under a 510K. Even though they do really different things, right? And you look at them, oh, that's really high tech. It shouldn't be. You know, like if you categorize by the principles of like class 3 being very high tech and sort of medium tech is class 2 and then not high tech at all is class 1, you look at a lot of those platforms and you're like, that's really high tech, it should be class 3. But there's like a loophole for a predicate device that has just been like incrementally every time there's like a marginal increase. So if you do it that way, it's fine because you can find a loophole to get into the market faster, basically.
You're doing a hack, but you're not exactly just pandering to what's like, oh, someone else has done exactly the same. So there are ways around that, and there's definitely games to be played around how you classify something. So in diagnostics, a screening test versus a diagnostic test versus a monitoring test versus a, so each of those categories have slightly different requirements. That's right.
And depending on the characteristics of the test you're developing, you might say, actually, I'm going to go for a, like a monitoring test first because that's easier because it matches my characteristics more. And then I'll develop later for the bigger market, which might be screening tests. Right? So there's games that you can play there, but then once you have your thing out on the market, potentially you can predicate that, to your next product, and which might be more innovative. So there's definitely ways of playing that game, and there's a whole industry of boutique consultancies set up to help you play this game. Okay, And it's usually very country specific as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there are people who are very good at trying to like pick through the pieces and find you the how to go through without having to go all the way to PMA.
Yeah. So this is such a wonky conversation. We just had so into the weeds. I wonder who's interested.
I don't know. You're the one who took me down this. You're supposed to be leading me. I just thought.
So let's talk about something less serious.
What do you want to talk about? The whole industry is serious. What are you talking about? It's life or death.
No, it's not. Not everything's serious. Sometimes it's. I don't know. Okay, I'll tell you a story. About insurance.
Okay. And you're talking about more exciting, less serious. And you want to talk about insurance.
Okay. Let's just say I have a friend.
Shit.
Who has been going to the same doctor for a variety of essential but insurance claimable services. But this year, apparently, and I can understand, like a lot of the insurers have put together this panel requirement. Mm-hmm. So even if you have the highest level of coverage, like you pay the most from a premium perspective, and you have full rider and you have the highest level of coverage, historically, wherever you've gone, you have been covered, right? Like by the book. Yeah. But now everything it has to be whether it's panel or non-panel, and I think that's just started maybe last year or this year. And so some of these doctors actually have an insurance claim specialist who they emphasize do not work for them, but will go and figure out how to submit the claim to get it authorized and make sure that you get covered, even though it's not a panel doctor.
So this is increasingly sounding like a US thing.
Oh, is it? Oh, tell me.
So
is that really what they do?
Oh yeah.
Okay, my friend is so new to this.
So, not naming names, but most hospitals in the US have a billing and reimbursement department.
Yeah.
And this is probably the most important department in the entire building. Okay?
Really?
Yeah, because this is where the money is made.
Yeah.
Billing. So every country has a slightly way of doing it, but because obviously the US is the most mature and most, let's say, historic. Yeah. A lot of practices get passed down to everywhere. So I'm not going to talk specifically about country because I don't know exactly how the billing practices work in every country. Sure. But let's talk broadly about how the US does it. Yeah. Okay. So there's these things called CPT codes. Yes. Okay. CPT codes are just numbers that have a label attached to them as to what this procedure is. Yeah. Okay. And they're actually published by the American Medical Association. Yeah, it's really difficult to find the right one. Yeah. And it's very complicated. So there's a lot of politics around the AMA, which we can go in later. Yeah. But let's talk about CPT first. Yeah. Okay, so CPT codes are the thing that an insurer or a big entity like a Medicare or Medicaid looks at and says, okay, this is what was done in the hospital or your care provider today, and therefore for each of these things, I'm going to pay X amount of dollars per code. Right. Okay. So there's coding departments in hospitals to try to maximize basically what dollar value they get from these codes, because there are obscure loopholes to a lot of these things. Interesting. And there's a lot of economics into these things, because some procedures are not very well reimbursed, and so the hospital is nominally losing money on them. Yeah. But if they lead to a big procedure that gets them a lot of money, then fine, I'll eat a little bit to gain a lot. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And then there's other procedures that are just like broadly covered. You don't have to justify them. They're broadly covered, and it's like 2 minutes of a doctor's script going, and then the hospital makes bank. Yeah. Okay. So there are certain categories of those things, and then they basically become overused. Right. Because almost every time a patient walks in, the doctor will just write that script. The same thing. Yeah. In order to get that billable. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now, these codes get even more complicated because there is a portion of the code that is the reimbursement for the device or the test itself. Yeah. So it's like the cost of that. Yeah. There's a portion that goes to the doctor. Yeah. It's like how much effort that they have to make for this particular step. Right. So you can imagine a surgery, like a knee replacement surgery, the surgeon gets paid quite a lot because
Yeah.
that's a lot of effort, right? And you would think something like an MRI scan, they would make relatively little,
Yeah.
but they make a decent amount, and that's why MRIs were so heavily
Really?
used. Because again, it's like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
The hospital
Quick
makes
one.
money.
Yeah.
The diagnostic company makes
Yeah.
money. So it's like, why wouldn't I
Yeah.
use more of this diagnostic equipment versus something that may be slightly less high tech but just fine.
Yeah.
Right. So there are all these games to play in how you code for what procedures are being done, and that's why there's also some, let's say, perverse incentive as well to do certain things. I'm not going to say not in the best interest of the patient, but you have other options.
Yeah.
Okay, but
Yeah.
this might be just the best way to bill.
Yeah. The most billable option.
Yes, the most billable option.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily bad, but it just becomes gold standard because
Yeah.
that's the way you make money,
Right.
essentially. And so there's games to play in here of like how you, especially if you launch a new test, you know, the test doesn't exist. So how does it fit in this code?
Yeah.
Right? Like where do you slot it in?
Yeah.
Right? So then you have to try to justify like, oh, because the AMA
Yeah.
takes at least 2 to 3 years to give you a new code.
Mm.
Okay, there's a lot of politics in there.
Yeah.
But let's just say it takes some time to get a new code, and it's very complicated. So before you get that code and you want to get paid, how do you make your test fit within one of these codes?
Yeah.
And so you have some options of crosswalking.
Yeah.
That's the terms like we agree that it looks like similar,
Yeah.
and so we'll just bill for that amount
Yeah.
that's given.
Right.
But I want to be paid for my innovation, so why would I want to be put in
Yeah.
the same level as something else? I have to
Yeah.
apply for the AMA for a script,
Right.
and then once I have the CPT code, I have to go to insurers and explain to them why my test should be much more,
Which they may
you know.
or may not accept.
Yes,
Yeah.
and then it becomes a game because
Yes.
there's private insurers, there's public insurers,
Yes.
there are Medicare providers. So like these
Yeah.
are the big, so
networks.
Medicare doesn't do all the work themselves, right? It's too much work. So for example, Blue Cross Blue Shield
Yeah.
takes care of a lot of like almost the southwest
Yeah.
states. So they have all
Blue
these.
Shield is not an insurer.
They are.
They are
But they work on behalf
of
Medicare.
a public insurer.
Yeah.
I see.
So they administer.
Right. Okay.
So they are the
Okay.
ones that try to decide coverage decisions.
Okay.
And like, because you can imagine there's a lot of admin,
Yeah.
right? So almost each region have a provider
Yeah.
that has been nominated basically by a public insurer to try to help them make all these decisions.
Right.
So you have a game to play when you enter that market to say, okay, am I going to try to convince a private insurer like a Cigna to insure my test first?
Yeah.
And I can gather some data to say how wonderful it is. Or I'm going to go, I'm so confident in my test, I'm going to go straight for one of the big public insurers. The thing is, if you go for one of the public insurer and
Yeah.
they turn you down, it's going to be very hard to get coverage anywhere.
Yeah.
You're out of the game.
Yeah. Okay.
Then you're going to have new data and you have to go back to them
Ooh,
and like,
painful.
you know, how,
Yeah.
you, like, give me something,
Yeah.
right? So your reimbursement strategy is a huge part of your sales strategy. How you get paid, how much you get paid, which entities you go for first to try to get a coverage decision.
Yeah.
This is the reason why a lot of companies will try to go for a 510K first.
Right.
Because that at least is something
least
to
it's
fall
got
back on.
something,
To
yeah,
say, I
yeah.
look the same as this
Yeah.
other thing potentially. So
Yeah,
I at least get
yeah.
something out of this
Yeah.
effort. It's not perfect, but there's reasons why people do it. Yeah.
They do that and then they add something incrementally.
Yes. And that's the whole game. That's why the whole
Yeah.
industry is incremental.
Right.
Because if you go big, you know, bang, and you say, okay, I'm going to spend 5 years developing this new
Yeah.
tech, and even if it goes to regulatory, none of the insurers want to pay for it, you're screwed,
Yeah.
right? That's millions, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars down the drain.
Yeah.
You have a marketable product and zero value.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's complicated.
That's the other title. It's complicated.
Yeah, that
the
should be the
medical device
subtitles.
podcast.
Yeah, the subtitle. It's
QALYfied,
complicated.
It's complicated.
I feel like I will be saying that sentence quite a lot.
That is one of your sentences, I have to say.
I think it's fair though. Don't you think it's fair that it's complicated?
I think it's very fair.
That was QALYfied, the podcast. If you like what you heard, please leave a positive review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever good podcasts are found, and recommend QALYfied to a friend.